Today I want to talk about, can you actually make money off a $100,000 unit? With the stock market taking its second biggest crash in history and what seemed like Armageddon happening, we settled on another property yesterday. Now I want to run through this property and run through some numbers and give you guys a bit of an idea of what we found so attractive in this property. Now, first and foremost, I really want to talk about the difference between a cheap property and a cheap property that has value in it. Now, just because something's cheap doesn't actually make it a good investment. And there is really so much more that you should be looking at when looking at a property rather than just its purchase price. Now, the unit that we just purchased was only $105,000. Some people spend more on their car than what we spent on that property. And I want to break down today why that property was appealing to us and why just because it was cheap doesn't actually mean it was a bad deal and where we see value in this property. First of all, I want to run through the numbers on this property and show how we saw this property as a really good cash flow opportunity for us. So stay with me and let's jump into this spreadsheet. So anyone that knows me knows that I love a good spreadsheet. Now, I think if you are investing in property, you're really best to create your own spreadsheet and really understand the numbers from the get-go, as it will make working out your actual financial position that much clearer. And especially if you can design your own spreadsheet, spend that little bit of time, the clarity it will give you will certainly be a massive positive. So this is for the unit we purchased. So we actually paid $105,000 for the unit. Like I say, this was a very cheap, financially a cheap property, but I think the property had considerable value. Without even going into the comparable sales and where it should have sat in the market, from a cash flow perspective alone, I think the property offered quite a valuable position inside our portfolio. So the purchase price was $105,000. We paid $3,000 in stamp duty. That's for the Queensland government. That's basically unavoidable. Our bank fees, we essentially ended up drawing out 2 loans for this property and financed essentially the whole purchase. So we ended up at about 103% finance by the time we did everything. We actually used the equity in another property and took out a second loan against that property to pay for the deposit and so on and so forth that was needed for this property. So a total acquisition cost, so the cost that it cost us to buy this property was $110,410, was the actual cost that it cost us come settlement to own this property. Now the council rates we've got here, these are essentially our outgoings. So we've got the council rates, the body corporate, our landlord insurance, which covers us for loss of rent or malicious damage, our water. Essentially our total fixed costs on this property was $6,340 per annum. Those costs really won't change over time. They're essentially a fixed cost. Now the tenant, this property, essentially the vendor that sold it to us, part of the deal was for us to rent the property back to him for 2 years. Due to his situation, that was something he thought was very appealing, that we would rent it back to him. The agreed upon rent was $260 per week, which works out to be $13,520 per year. So what I consider our real net return is the purchase price, is our rental return minus the fixed costs of the purchase price. So it works out that this property is a 6.5% net return. So if you can borrow at the moment sub 3%, it shows that this property is considerably cash flow positive. Now, our borrowing we've managed to secure with the ANZ Bank on this one, and they're currently offering a 2-year fixed fee of 2.88. So that is very competitive in the home loan environment at the moment, and essentially really helps this property stack up. So our principal and interest repayments, we've got this as on a P&I loan, and essentially our repayments are $95 a week, or $494 per annum, and then you've got our interest payments. Essentially the net cash flow position, so if it was interest only, the net cash flow position on this property is $4,000 a year that this property would generate us. Because we are paying off some principal as well,
The actual true cash flow is $2,240, but for tax reasons, essentially we're making $4,000 a year off this property, which is a really good return on a $105,000 home. So that's 6.5% return. So that's a bit of a guide as to how I've worked out the cash flow position in this property. And essentially it is quite cash flow positive. So it's $76 a week. Cash flow on a $105,000 property, that stacks up really well in my books and is something that we were quite excited about.
With the property nice and heavily cash flow positive, the other real appeal of this property, and something that people often shy away from units for, was the land value. Most people look at units and go, there's not enough land value in them, so they prefer to be buying freehold properties. Now this property was set in a complex of 4 units, and essentially the government land value on the 1,000 square metre block that these 4 units sit on was $290,000. Now typically the land value on the government land values are considerably lower than what the actual value of the land would be. In my opinion, the actual land value on this site was probably somewhere around the $330,000 to $350,000. But let's stick to the conservative sort of $290,000 to $330,000 mark. And essentially that puts the land value of this site, so our ownership of the land, at somewhere between $70,000 to $80,000. Now keeping in mind that we only paid $105,000 for this property, essentially means that we only really paid $25,000 to $35,000 for the actual building. The vast majority of the value in this property is tied up in the land, and so while it is a unit, there is a tremendous amount of value in the actual land on this property, and that was one of the really appealing factors that we sort of saw when we were looking at this property. The other big factor that drew us towards this property was that it is located in Cairns. So for people that have been watching my channel, you might know that I am based in Cairns and we buy a lot of property in this area. But people may not actually know the stats on Cairns. So Cairns is Australia's 14th biggest city. There's a population of around 170,000 people in Cairns, and it has quite a diverse economy. While being reliant on tourism, there's also a big healthcare sector, education sector, and a big navy base in Cairns. So there is quite a broad economy, and this provides a fair bit of resilience. We're not buying into a small mining town that relies on one company. There are a number of employers in this city. And being the 14th biggest city in Cairns, 14th biggest city in Australia, it has the size there that property is relatively liquid. Most properties are selling within that 30 to 60 day window, so that if you do need to sell, you are able to sell in a reasonable time frame. So there's the considerations that we were looking at when we bought this property. And just goes to show, just because a property is cheap doesn't mean that it's not good value. So have a look. If you are looking at cheap properties, make sure you really knuckle down and distinguish, is it just cheap and nasty, or is it cheap and has value into it? Thanks for watching, guys, and if you do enjoy this video, check out our recent duplex purchase and what we saw in that property. That was a bit of a different price point, but also gives you a great guide on that one. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and have a fantastic day.